Hi guys, this is Miss Sydney from Peters Township Public Library, and thank you for joining me for another Friday Night Frights. I am not by a campfire or my fireplace right now like I usually am. It's a little warm for that. I'm actually sitting in my basement where it's nice and cool. So tonight's Friday Night Frights is from R.L. Stine's Beware. Beware is actually a collection of R.L. Stine's favorite scary stories. So in here it has things from all sorts of different authors, but it also has a few original short stories by R.L. Stine as well that you won't find in Goosebumps. So we're going to read one of those. Beware by R.L. Stine, and this is published by Harper Collins. At the beginning of each story or thing he shares in here, he actually tells why he likes it so much. So at the beginning he explains why he wrote this story. Our story we're going to be reading is called The Surprise Guest by R.L. Stine. Here's what he has to say about it. Of course Halloween is my favorite holiday. I don't need to tell you that, do I? It's the one day of the year when everyone can have good, scary fun. Over the years, I've read hundreds of creepy Halloween stories, and I've written a few myself. When I sat down to write The Surprise Guest, I suddenly started to think about ghosts and haunted things. And so I decided to write a ghost story and a Halloween story combined. The kids in this story think they're throwing a normal Halloween costume party, but they have no idea who is about to show up. The Surprise Guest. I had a sleepover at Danny Grover's house the night before Halloween, so I heard the story about the haunted Halloween costume before anyone else. Danny and I love to tell scary stories. Sometimes we stay up long after midnight telling story after story, trying to give each other chills. I tell pretty good ghost stories, but Danny's stories are always more terrifying than mine. He makes up stories like The Headless Gym Teacher and The Werewolf Under the Bed. The stories are always about people in our families or people we know. Sometimes the stories are so creepy, they make me feel a little cold and shaky. Danny has a really good imagination. But this time he swore that the haunted costume story was true. I laughed when he said that. If only I had believed him. My name is Tony Wayne. Danny and I are both 10. We've been friends since 2nd grade. We have a Halloween party every year. Some years it's at my house, and this year it was at Danny's. Danny's parties are always better than mine, and his costumes are always scarier than mine. Danny is very popular at school. The girls all think he's the coolest. I guess it's because he has a great sense of humor. He is always goofing on things and cracking jokes. He is always breaking up with the class. But the teachers all love him anyway. Everyone loves Danny. He can get away with a lot because of his looks. He has big blue eyes and curly blonde hair and deep dimples in his cheeks when he flashes that devilish grin. My 7-year-old sister, Claudia, thinks that Danny looks like Brad Pitt. She's totally gaga over him. When he comes over, she follows him around like a puppy dog. Why do I have to hang out with such a winner? I don't know. I guess maybe I think some of it will rub off on me. Anyway, the night before the Halloween party, I went over to Danny's house to help with the decorations. Danny and I took fat paintbrushes and painted some jack-o'-lanterns black. They looked really creepy. We painted ugly monster faces on some other pumpkins. Danny's were a lot funnier than mine. He's a really good artist. Danny held one up. Hey, Tony, this one kind of looks like Celia Blakely, he said. I burst out laughing. That's not funny, Danny's mom said. Celia is a lovely girl. Why do you always make fun of her? Before we could answer, the doorbell rang. It was Celia Blakely. She lives next door. She came over to help Danny get the house ready for the party. Celia flipped her long red hair behind her shoulders. Hi, Danny. Hi, Tony. What can I do to help? You can climb to that fireplace and see if it works, Danny joked. I laughed, but Celia just groaned and rolled her eyes. You can help me with the eyeball punch, Mrs. Grover said. See, I'm painting ping pong balls to look like eyeballs. Once they're dry, we'll drop them in the punch. Great, Celia said. She picked up a slender paintbrush and began painting eyeballs. But Danny and I knew the real reason she showed up. She wanted to brag about her costume. At our parties, we always have a costume contest. Danny and Celia always have the 2 best costumes, but Celia wins the contest every year. Last year, Celia came to the party as a Powerpuff Girl. She had those huge black eyes, and somehow she put a thick black outline around her whole body. She really did look like a cartoon. Danny just stood there in his 10-foot-tall King Kong costume. He knew he had lost. Go ahead, Celia, I said. Tell us what your costume is this year. I'm going to be an amazing Catwoman, Celia said. My costume is awesome. She grinned at Danny. I don't want to give too much away, she said, but it's electric. I mean, it's totally wired. Celia raked the air with her fingers. She hissed like an angry cat about to attack. Watch out for my claws, guys. Sounds great, I muttered. I knew my pointy-eared hobbit costume wouldn't compete. And what second-place costume did you pick out? Celia asked Danny. I'm not telling, he replied. My costume this year is so terrifying, I don't want to tell anyone. Celia snickered and made a face at him. You know I always win. Danny had a strange smile on his face. Not this year, he whispered. Not this year. That night in his room, Danny showed me his costume. A monster costume covered in orange fur with red and purple scabs up and down the body. The mask was black, an ugly animal face with a wolfish snout, open to reveal 2 rows of jagged yellow fangs. What do you think? Is it scary? Danny asked. I shook my head. Pretty good, I said. But not great, I sighed. Celia's going to win again. Danny hung the costume on a hook on the wall. You don't know the story of this costume, he whispered. It has to win. He turned off the lights. We climbed into our beds and he told me the story in a low, whispery voice. This is the true story, he said. I didn't make it up. The man at the costume store told it to me. He didn't want to sell me the costume. Why? I asked. Because the costume may be haunted. I laughed. Give me a break, I said. Danny raised his right hand as if swearing an oath. Total truth, he said. No lie. Just listen. A boy died inside this costume. I sat up and stared at him. His eyes flashed in the shadowy light. I could see how excited he was. Danny continued in a whisper. This has happened a long time ago, at least 100 years. The boy's name was Henry. He was about our age, and he lived in a castle somewhere in Europe. Was he a prince or something, I asked? Danny shook his head. I don't know. I only know he was invited to a fancy costume party at another castle. He wanted to scare everyone at the party. So he had this fur-covered monster costume made. It was created especially for him. But he never made it to the party. Why not? I asked. How did he die? No one is sure, Danny whispered. They found him dead on the floor of his room in front of the mirror. He was wearing the costume. His hands were still gripping the sides of the mask. I felt a chill run down my back, and I stared at the costume. Henry was stone cold dead, Danny continued. Some people think that he suffocated, that he couldn't get enough air inside the mask. But Henry's parents didn't agree. They thought the costume was evil and cursed. They were heartbroken. They didn't want the costume in the castle, but they were afraid to destroy it. They were afraid of its evil. So they stuffed it into a large wooden trunk and labeled the trunk, never to be opened. Then they shipped it away on a boat. And that's how the costume came to America? I asked. Danny nodded. The trunk was hidden away for years and years in a big storage warehouse. Then one day, about 30 years ago, a boy named James opened the trunk and found it. His father owned the warehouse. His father knew the legend of the costume, but he didn't believe it. So he let James take the costume home. I swallowed. Then what happened? I asked. What happened to James? James wore it because he wanted to terrify everyone at a Halloween party, Danny said. Well, he did terrify everyone, but not in the way he wanted. What do you mean? I whispered, sitting straight up and hugging myself to stop the shivers. James went to the party in the costume, and it was a big success. Kids screamed, everyone loved it, the costume was so scary. But the scariest moment of all, when James took off the costume, Danny leaned forward, his eyes glowing in the dark bedroom. You see, at the end of the party, when it came time to take off the costume, James wasn't inside it. A stranger was inside the costume. A surprise guest. A boy no one had ever seen before. Huh? I cried. You mean? Danny nodded. Yes, he whispered. It was Henry. Henry pulled off the costume, stepped up to the startled kids, and introduced himself to everyone. But where was James? I sputtered. Danny shrugged. James disappeared. Gone. Vanished. He was never seen again. Some people think he haunts his costume, just the way Henry did, waiting inside for his chance to come back. Danny pulled the covers over his chin. You see, he whispered, it's a very scary costume, and it has to win tomorrow. Before the party the next day, I brought my costume over to Danny's. I hung it up beside his in the bedroom closet. Kids were arriving downstairs. Danny rushed out to pick up his cousin Allison and walk her to the party. Gazing in the closet, I sighed. My hobbit costume looked pretty lame next to Danny's. I rubbed my hand over the heavy monster fur. I squeezed the hard yellow fangs of the mask. And suddenly, I had an idea. I'm going to try on Danny's costume, I murmured. I'm just going to see what it feels like, I told myself. I lifted the heavy mask between my hands. Or maybe I'll just wear it downstairs. Maybe I'll wear it down to the party and give Danny a little surprise. After all, why should Danny always get all the attention? Why does Danny always have to be the star? I pulled the monster costume out. I held it up against me, and I tried to imagine what would look like inside it. My heart started to pound. What if Danny's story is true? I thought, what if the costume really is haunted? No, that's crazy, I decided. Danny made up the whole story. Danny's always making up scary stories. I stepped into the furry legs. Then I pulled the costume up over my body. It was heavier than I imagined, and smellier. The fur felt stiff like the hard bristles of a hairbrush. I tugged the mask over my head. I twisted it until I could see through the narrow eye holes. I started toward the mirror, then suddenly stopped, gripped with fear. Was the costume haunted? Was everyone else inside it with me? I gasped for breath. I felt cold sweat on my forehead. James? Are you in here? James? Silence. My whole body began to itch. My legs felt weak. James? No, of course there's no one else in here, I told myself. It was another one of Danny's stories. I tugged the mask off, taking deep breaths of cool air. Then I pulled myself out of the costume. I hung it back up in the closet, and I pulled out the hobbit costume and began to tug it on. Leaning over, I adjusted the big hobbit feet. Then I pulled on the rubber hobbit mask with its pointy ears. I checked myself out in the mirror, and I headed to the stairs. I stopped on the top step, and a frightened moan escaped my throat. Oh, I froze. My costume. I wasn't alone inside it. I could sense another presence. I could hear soft breathing. I could feel someone else inside the costume with me. Trapped inside the dwarf-like hobbit body, I felt someone pushing me out, away. Hey, what's going on? I cried out. My voice sounded muffled and faint, far away. What's happening? No answer. Is someone there? Answer me. James, is that you? I've been waiting so long, a voice whispered, and now it's my turn to come out. No, that's impossible, I wailed. You're in Danny's costume. He told me the whole story. He told me about your ghost haunting the monster's costume. Trick or treat, James whispered. I switched costumes. And then I could feel him pushing me hard, pushing me away into the deep darkness. I felt weaker. No, please, I tried to yell out. But my voice was just a whisper, a distant whisper. And then I was gone. Outside the costume, all air, no body. I was just air, floating around the costume. I watched James walk down the stairs, James from 30 years ago, James inside the hobbit costume now. I could hear him, I could see him, I seemed to float all around him. Later at the end of the party, when he pulled off the mask, I saw my horrified friends and I heard their screams of shock. I watched them scream and I heard Celia shout to the stranger, "Where's Tony? What have you done to Tony?" She's really worried about me, I realized. Celia really likes me. And then I saw Danny clench his hands into tight fists. "Who are you?" he demanded from the stranger. "What are you doing in my house? Where's my friend Tony?" Good question. Where was I? Where? "My name is James," I heard the voice say, "and I'm so happy to be at your party." Yes, James had stepped out of the costume. James was at the party. But where was I? I was gone, floating in the air. And then I felt myself pulled down into a costume, into someone's costume, into the deep darkness inside. That was last year. And now it's almost Halloween once again. And I'm waiting inside a costume. I'm waiting for my chance to return. It's been so long. I've been waiting in here so long. But now it's my turn. My turn. But who owns the costume? Who plans to wear my costume for Halloween? Try on your costume, okay? I know it's early, but just try it on, please. Please try it on now. Come on. What harm could it do? The end. Well, I hope you enjoyed The Surprise Guest by R.L. Stine and his collection of short stories called Beware. And in case you haven't heard, Peters Township Public Library is opening up for curbside service. So if you go online to our catalog, ptlibrary.org, you'll be able to request some books and we'll schedule time for you to come pick those up. But thanks for joining us and have a spooky night. Bye, guys.